Good morning and welcome to Into the Terminal Episode 1. I'm your host, Eric the IT Guy Hendricks, and joining me is my co-host, Scott McBrien.
Hi. And today we're going to cover users and groups.
With that said, we're going to go ahead and dive on in with we're going to need a Linux box, and today we're going to be logged in as a administrative user, in this case root. All right, so
And
first
let's
step,
just,
go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say, let's jump in and talk about adding a new user. So we've got a user that we want to add to the system named Tony. And the user add command will take care of assigning all of their relevant details and creating their home directory and setting up their account. What we also need to do is set a password for Tony. And as the administrative user, you get to determine what password that should be, even if it's a bad one. All right, so at this point, Tony is ready to go, and we can send Tony his password, and he can log into the box.
So a lot of times, what we'll want to do is make sure that Tony has the right permission sets when he logs into the system for the first time. So in today's scenario, we're going to assume that Tony is a student. So it's fair to assume that whatever the purpose of the server is, it's to accomplish a certain task. So let's say that Tony is a student and he needs access to a lab environment. So we're going to go ahead and create a group called student.
All right, so the command for that is group add. I know this is blowing your mind after the user add command. And then we need to take our user and add them to that group. So for that, we're going to modify the user with user mod. We're going to append a new group named student to Tony's memberships. And we can verify this by running the groups command to inspect Tony's groups. And you can see that Tony is a member of his personal private group and his new group that we assigned him, the student group.
Now he'll be able to log in, he'll be able to change his password, access his home directory, and start carrying out any tasks that he's allowed through both his personal user account and through the group user account.
Yeah, so why don't we dive a little bit deeper and take a look at some of the other things that we may need to do with users and groups.
So we made it 3.5 minutes before we blew a transition. Sorry about that. I was going to transition to the next section. So this is our first episode, and we've been pitching this for a little while now, and I'm really excited about it. We nailed the first section, and so the hope is to have about 3 minutes of just this is how you do this, and this, and these commands, these processes will help you establish a particular operation, whether that's installing packages, creating users and groups. The first 3 minutes are going to be just how to do a specific thing, and then Scott and I are going to dive in a little bit deeper. Scott mentioned password complexity. We talked about group permissions. What happens if Tony graduates and he's no longer a student, or in this case gets kicked out, perhaps. So we want to spend a few minutes going through the specifics of the command. We'll have a little bit of a chat session. We've got live Q&A on YouTube, Twitch, and you can join our Discord channel. And then we'll get into a little bit of a deeper dive, maybe share some war stories. But this content is for all of you, our live listeners, and those of you that catch us after the fact. So the YouTube link that you got here to see the live stream is the same link that will be around for as long as YouTube exists. So when it becomes part of the singularity, that link should still work. So be sure to share this with your friends, with your colleagues. We hope that the content over the next however many episodes we can come up with will be helpful. Got
And by the
anything to
way,
add?
don't forget, yeah, I was going to say, don't forget to like if you like it, share it if you think it's good for other people. And then if there's things that you're interested in or you have questions on, please put them in the comments because myself and Eric do read the comments and can respond there as needed.
At this point, should we tell the people to share even if they don't like it?
I mean, we're desperate for shares, so probably.
Hey, it's episode one. So, do you want to tell folks about our launch efforts here, and then we'll dive in a little bit deeper.
Yeah, so for the next basically 4 weeks, we're going to be running daily shows with basic administration, critical administration skills for Linux, and then we'll scale that back to a more reasonable for Eric and myself to manage schedule. In addition to the morning show, we're also going to be running an evening show so we can pick up viewers from other geographies or who are just interested in non work hours in some geographies.
Awesome. So, users and groups. We talked about how to create a user. We set a password. Always set a password, please, and have it be something more than just password 123. You'd be surprised how often that's the case. Um, we talked a little bit about groups. So let's look a little bit deeper, and we'll bring Scott's lab system back up here, and let's talk about what happens if we have a contractor or something, someone who's going to be there for a very short, limited amount of time. Is there a way within Linux that we can kind of put a time box around that user account?
Yeah. So there's a command that we have that we use for all kinds of password and account aging criteria, and it's called Chage. So if I do a Chage-L to list the account and password aging information for Tony, it'll show me some stats about Tony. So we can see things like when the password for Tony was last changed. We can set expiration times or when his password will become inactive after it expires. We can set an automatic time for his account to automatically turn off. We can also set some criteria around forcing password changes and the timing around that. And so we can make those changes with the change command. Eric, do you have any recommended practices you'd like to see us apply to Tony?
Something I think we'd want to talk about is uh, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Uh, so a lot of times a contractor will be hired for a set number of days or a set number of or during the length of the project. What's nice is we could set a 90-day or a 365-day uh, password or account expiration. So let's say we're bringing Tony in for just 90 days. He's here. He's going to help us with a project, and then he's out. So let's figure out what's 90 days from today, and let's have his account set to expire.
Okay. So, not being the person who remembers all the things all the time, a lot of commands will have options to give you some usage help. So let me do a change-h, and we can look at what options we might need and what parameters they take. So I think for setting his account expiration, see how it says dash capital E, and then we have to put in an expiry date. Um, and let's take a look at the man page for Chage so we can see what format that date should be. So I'm just going to search for dash capital E. Right, and here they give a nice example of how you could do it for 180 days. So why don't we just copy that?
I can't tell you how many times I come into the man pages, look at the examples, and just copy and paste that command.
Yeah. So let's just say 90 days from today. Whoop. Oh, I
Oh.
forgot to tell us to do it to Tony. That would help. Um, yeah, so a lot of times man pages will have examples that you can use. There's another one that I use all the time for iSCSI logins because the
Hmm.
syntax for that is so onerous. But that was great to see. And what we can see from this example is that really what it's looking for, the dash capital E option is looking for, is the format 4-digit year dash month dash day, right? So we could do a change dash E 2022 05 31. And this would set Tony's last day of his account before it expires as May 31st.
So when we did Chage-L, there was a couple of other lines of information around password expiration. So I know as systems administrators, one of the things that we had to do on a regular basis was go in and rotate passwords for administrative accounts. Um, and what's nice about the Chage command is we can actually set this up to have a warning period, a kind of a soft reset date, and then a hard reset date. So if
Oh,
we do a Chage-L on Tony,
yep.
excuse me, we can see that his last password change was today because that's when we set the password. And then there's two lines about password expiration.
Yeah, and if you look at the help, let me turn my screen and we can look at the help together. There's two settings there. We have the um, min number of days and max number of days. So min number of days is they have to keep their password for this many days before they're allowed to change it again. And max days is they have to keep their password, or this is when their password expires and they can't use it past that. So we could do something like for Tony here. Why don't we say that his password has to be changed every 30 days? So we'll do a change dash capital M 30 Tony. And now if we look at a change dash L, sorry, it's too early. I haven't had enough coffee.
I hear you.
We could see that his days has been set to 30 like we expect, but also he now has a password expire time, whereas before um, this said that it was never, right? And then earlier we had set his account expiration time, and you can see that that date has been applied as well.
So I noticed at the bottom of the output here that it says number of days of warning before password expires. This is hugely helpful because I don't know about all of you, but I tend to forget that, oh, yeah, I've got that password expiration coming up. I should probably reset my password now before it forces me, just because you never know what you're going to be in the middle of when you're trying to log into a server. So it's best to do that kind of on your own terms. So what that warning does is whenever you log in within that 7-day period, it'll actually tell you, hey, your password is set to expire within X number of days. You might want to reset it now. And that gives you the chance to kind of go through, pick a good password, and then reset it on your own terms. Because once you hit that 30 days, it will force you to change your password, and that's kind of for lack of a better term, that's kind of a soft reset or a soft lockout, where it'll force you to change your password on login, and then it'll actually log you back out and force you to go through the login process again with the new password. But there's also kind of a hard lockout where your account is actually disabled until an administrator comes in and unlocks that account for you.
Yeah, and
Nothing
that's
more.
actually where we're at. That's where we're at today, right? On April 6th, if Tony doesn't update his password, he will be locked out of the account. If we wanted to give a grace period of a few days where when he logs in, he's pushed to change it automatically, that's what that password inactive means. So we could set that to a certain number of days to provide a little bit of grace period where he logs in with an expired password and we immediately force him to change it. But it has to happen before that password inactive expires. And
So
Eric,
we
I did want to show one last thing on password
Yeah.
aging because I want to show you that the change command is really a front end to a configuration file, right? So if we take a look for Tony's password out of the Etsy shadow file, which is where passwords are stored. So this big long encrypted gobbledygook, this is actually Tony's encrypted password. And then we get this colon separated set of values here at the end. This is what we've been messing around with Chage. So it has things like the date of last password change and how many days they have to keep a password before they're allowed to change it again, and how many days they are allowed to have a password before they're required to change it again, and how many days in advance of that are they warned to change it, right? And you can look at these and see things like this 7 here that matches the number of warning days before the password expires. The other days are stored in the number of days that have elapsed since January 1st, 1970, which is a date known as the Unix epoch. And so Chage is really handy because it takes those really gross day, machine formatted days and actually turns it into a human readable date that you see in the Chage-L output.
Definitely. So I wanted to dive in on more of a philosophical question real quick before we move on to the next command. But we mentioned in passing the minimum number of days between password changes. So this is war stories with Eric and Scott, but I've only ever seen this used in one way. Basically, the only time I've ever seen that set to anything but zero is I worked as a government contractor at one point where you're only allowed to change your password once in a 24-hour period, and I never quite understood the mentality behind that. I don't know if that was designed to avoid someone from compromising your password and then changing it to something else. But I personally have never enforced that as a systems administrator. Have you ever come across any use cases that might be useful for a minimum number of days?
So yes, and it was a similar environment where I worked for a large entity, and they had rules, things like you couldn't reuse the same password for six
Mm-hmm.
passwords. And so what people would do is they change their password, change it back to the original password. So they would just like upload a series of passwords so they could exceed that six password history and then set it back to its original value that they had already committed to memory. So that's one of the behaviors that setting the minimum number of days will combat.
That's a great point. And actually, now that you say that, that experience kind of came rushing back to me. I ended up getting to a point where I had like six different 18 some odd character passwords that I basically had memorized. And the fun part was trying to remember which one of my passwords am I using now because I just changed it yesterday.
Yeah.
Here's a good question for you, Scott. So you mentioned that in the Etsy shadow file that we can see the changes that we've made with the change command. Would you recommend people making changes directly to the Etsy shadow file?
Absolutely not. So if we take a look at the permissions on Etsy Shadow, you can see that no permissions are granted on this file because we don't want people, number one, looking at it, and number two, making direct edits to it. Because a typo in here can have pretty drastic consequences for users on the machine. So we want to use tools like Chage or UserAdd and UserDel to manipulate the data in this file rather than trying to manually edit it.
That was kind of a trick question. You passed. Good job.
I'm a professional.
At least that's what we're told to tell people. So,
Regardless of what Eric says.
so I think we've beat the change command to death, but it's an exceptionally powerful tool and really helps with some of the minutia of user account management. Um, so this is something that you added to the notes. But using standard input for the password command. Earlier, we typed in the password command in the user, and then we said the password twice in a row, which is fine if you're managing your own user. But if you're not in an environment that has like automated provisioning, like an Ansible playbook or something baked into an image, that can get really tedious having to type in either temporary passwords or service account passwords multiple times. So back in the days before infrastructure as code and that kind of thing, back in the dark ages of bash scripts for everything, not Perl scripts, but bash scripts at least. Although I did work for a company that used Perl a lot for this kind of thing, but that's a horror story for another day. But a lot of times in bash command or in bash scripts, you could pass the password into the script and have it applied. So you want to talk through exactly how that works, Scott? Because this is something that I wish I would have used more as a sysadmin.
Sure. And another place where I see it used pretty prevalently even today is because when you kickstart a box, right, when you do an automated provisioning of the system, after it's finished installing its Red Hat software, you have a section where you can write scripts to execute on the machine to complete its setup and install. And so if there were users that had to be provisioned on the machine so that when it was turned on for the first time, they were ready to go, that's where you would put it. And because it's written in Bash, tools like this password dash dash standard in option are really handy. All right, so let me clear the screen here. And you'll recall from earlier when I set Tony's password, as Eric mentioned, I had to type it in a couple times. Well, this time, what we're going to do is we're just going to echo this string, right? So all it does is it just prints this string. And we're going to take that string, and instead of printing it to the screen, we're going to pipe it to password standard in Tony. Right, and notice that it took the password and told me that it had updated it successfully, and there was no interactivity on my part. Right, all I did was take the string I wanted to set as Tony's password and push it into his user account. And so this is a way that you can um, more automatedly create passwords. Also, and it doesn't look like I have it. There is a command called mkpassword
Hmm.
that will make a randomized password. And that's something else that I've used in conjunction with password standard in, but you have to save what that random string is somewhere so you can tell someone what it is. And if I remember correctly, it comes from the expect RPM, but maybe we'll look at that at a later episode.
Yeah, that'd be great. That's one I often forget about. I just end up generating a random password in my password manager and then saving that to the team password manager and then copying pasting it into the terminal. It's great fun.
That sounds like a lot of work, Eric.
Way too much work. So the advantage is you don't have to type in the password multiple times. Another advantage is you can actually see it visibly on the screen to make sure that that zero is not accidentally an O or not that I've ever done that. But something that dawned on me while you're typing that command in is this could be a bit of a security concern, just because I'd imagine that command shows up in the bash history file.
It does, but realize that that's a bash history file for root on this machine, right? We're executing this as an logged in as the root user. So in order to access that, you would have to be logged into the box as root. And if that's happening, you probably have larger problems to deal with. But if it's really that much of a concern, things like mkpassword would be nice because it would just show the mkpassword command in the history. But again, you'd have to use another shell command like T or something else to store that automatically generated password somewhere for later use. Otherwise, you wouldn't see it because it goes directly into the password command and is not printed to the screen or anything.
Yeah, that's perfect. Well, we'll have to share that one in the show notes. Speaking of, before we move on to our next command, check back usually about an hour or so after the show, because we will try and update the show notes with chapter markers as well as links to some of the labs that are applicable, even some documentation or some blog posts. The Red Hat blog has a section called Enable Sysadmin that has awesome articles. So just a quick PSA there. So here's a problem for you, sysadmin Scott. Um, we found out that Tony is up to something a little bit nefarious. He's going in and like changing test scores or something in our system. So we need to lock that account out. Is there an easy way I can do that, or do I have to go over and pull the cord out of the wall?
Sure. So we can, well, so if he's already logged into the system, we'd have to do something like look at all the processes and like kill his bash shell. But before we do that, we probably want to lock him out so he doesn't just log back in again. So we're going to do a password dash L on Tony. All right. So again, this manipulates the Etsy shadow file. Um, so what it did was it created this or prepended this double exclamation mark in the encrypted password field. And that means that no matter what Tony types in his password, once we encrypt it and we compare it to this string, it can never match because encrypted strings that we compare with don't start with a double exclamation point. So that's how we lock Tony. And then we'd have to do something like a process status to look at his processes and kill them off. So that when he tries to log back in, he'd be locked out. There is also, I think, a user mod option to do this, isn't there, Eric?
Yeah, I think so.
So let's
Luckily,
do
we can
user
do it
mod
dash
dash
H.
H. Yeah, there you go, capital L. If we did this on Tony, it would also lock his account, and it operates the same way.
Funny, I tend to use the password dash L command, even though user mod dash L is the same thing. So I think that's one of the things that folks find so intimidating about the command line initially is like most things in life, there's like 12 different ways to do a single task. So the tendency is just find something that works for you and go with it. Like user del, group add, user mod. A lot of those commands are similar across the board, across distributions and across versions. A lot of these commands haven't changed all that much since they were originally written like back in the Unix days. So find something that works for you and go with it. It's really helpful, and I know people that prefer like a terminal user interface, a TUI, but at the same time, you can just use password dash L or user mod dash L. It's just so many different ways to do any particular task. So as we kind of wrap up this episode, I want to talk about how do we clean up our environment? How do we delete users or groups? And then I've got a kind of a follow up discussion question for you.
Okay. So if we wanted to remove Tony, we could do a user del Tony. And user del has two options, or an option that we might be interested in, which is -R. So if I just user del Tony, it removes all of his account information from the system configuration files, but it leaves his home directory in place. If I use user del -R, it will remove his home directory, and that will also delete all of his files. So depending on what your retention policy is at your where you work, or what you decide your retention policy should be on your own systems, that'll determine whether you want to use the R to remove this user's files or just remove the user definition.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about. Uh, so in my 10 or so years, geez, as a sysadmin, a lot of times we never deleted a user's home directory, or if we did, it was usually after some predetermined amount of time, maybe a year or something. Um, so, in your experience, was it better to lock out a user account or to delete an account? Or I guess now we have a third option of deleting an account but leaving all the files.
So personally, I like doing a lock, right? So I lock the password so the person can't access the machine anymore. And that keeps their account in place and all their files in place. And I'll leave it like that for a long time, because it could be that that person returns and all you need to do is unlock their account and they get all of their content back without any changes. Um, the bigger thing is you don't want to delete that person's data, because at some point somebody else in their team might need a file that they had. Or as I mentioned, maybe they return to the company and they want to continue their work. I actually have had that experience where somebody left an organization I was with for a few years, and they came back and they wanted to resume the research they had and data files they had, and they were already gone. And we had to like delve deep into the backups to try and find them, and it took days to restore that data back. So again, it's I think the true answer is it depends. Depends on what's most important for your organization.
Standard
Um,
operating procedure. It depends.
right. But if you are going to delete someone and delete their files, make sure that you have a backup of that content somewhere, so that if you need those files, you can get them. And really, probably my recommendation would be a staged approach if you wanted to go down that route. So first lock them for a period of time, then delete their account but leave their files in place, and then pull the backup and delete their files. That way, if the files are already in place but they're not owned by that person anymore, you can use other administrative commands like the change owner command, to give those files to someone else that may need them in your organization. Or you can move them around in the directory tree if you need.
So what you're implying is that systems administrators are sometimes lazy or careless and run processes right out of their home directory? Say it ain't so. Not no.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's not just system administrators. It's like you're given a home directory for a reason. It's your home for your things, right? Um, but I think that more likely uh, we tend to just execute a task without thinking about the long-term ramifications of executing that task, right? So somebody's like, "Oh, Tony left. Go ahead and remove his account." That the gut reaction is userdel-r Tony, and then you find out, weeks, months, or years later that you actually needed that content.
So that happened to me once. We had a systems administrator leave, and he'd written this really nice report. I'm pretty sure it was in Perl. That pulled all kinds of different data, metrics, performance information, and that kind of thing off of the system, and using some crazy command line kung fu, he was able to compile it into like a CSV file, and then email that CSV file out to our team's mailing list, and it just showed up in our inbox once a week or something. And a few months later, we were trying to troubleshoot something that a performance leak or something that had happened, and went looking for the report, and lo and behold, it wasn't there. And guess where it was? It was in the user's home directory, which we deleted months before, and it was definitely calling out to our tape archive third party company and tracking down what dates we deleted the user and figuring out when was the last good full backup and calling those tapes back and then of course that server was like retired or something, so we had to restore the data to some jump server somewhere with plenty of disk and then explode out all that content. It was a whole thing, but we got our manager's pretty report back. It just took way too long.
Yeah, and there are reasons why you like don't want crusty data laying around on your systems. Just make sure that you have a backup plan. I think that's one of the like most important things for administrators to think about is if this goes awry, what's my out? What's my backup?
Mm-hmm.
And that might be a backup of data, but it may also be like an alternate host or all kinds of things. A tape archive, a tar file somewhere, so that it's still ready and able to access without having to go to something slow like a tape library to get it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and that's definitely staged approaches, multiple layers of redundancy. Maybe we could have a lab free episode to kind of go through and talk through some of the strategies that we've used. Um, I'm sure that won't uncover any pain that will require some therapy time.
and we could talk about the Department of Redundancy department.
That sounds perfect. So one thing we didn't that we ran out of time to cover, but is the web UI. Managing users, managing groups, incredibly easy to do through the web console. We'll have to rethink tomorrow's episode to manage that. I don't know why we didn't put that in the show notes or in the episode notes, but we'll try and put a link to some web UI information on how to manage users and groups. Speaking of show notes, you want to tell folks what we're covering tomorrow?
I believe we're covering file permissions tomorrow.
We are indeed. So Chmod, and ironically enough, there's actually commands to change ownerships for groups as well. So it'll be a great episode. Tell your friends. This today is kind of a great example of what to expect. Some very direct processes and commands. A little bit of banter back and forth because it's Scott and me. What do you expect? And then some deeper dives, some discussion. And I know today's the first episode, and it's a Monday morning, so hopefully looking at some live Q&A. Would love to answer your questions. And like Scott said at the top of the episode, feel free to add comments. We do read those. We are looking for more episode ideas or questions that you may have, because you never know. Your question may end up becoming the topic of an episode. So with that said, we're a little bit over time. We're going to try and keep this sub 30 minutes. So just we talked a little bit more about the format of the show. So just 3 minutes at the top, 30-minute episode length. So feel free to give us your feedback. We're experimenting a little bit with this episode format. But other than that, thank you so much. And I know Scott will be back on this evening. Check the YouTube upcoming events or Twitch for that time and place. And then otherwise, I will see you, Scott, tomorrow.
Sounds great. See you tomorrow, Eric.
Thanks all.